and we'll go ahead and start in. And for those of you that do not know AJ Hendershot, he is and I'm not just saying this because he's here, he's one of the most versatile people I've ever seen in talent and experience and hands-on. And alive, you're in for a treat right here. So AJ's actually got two presentations. This is a historic range of the Ozark Chinquapin. And this one is literally evolving all the time, is it not, AJ?
Oh my gosh, it was evolving as of yesterday afternoon. I expect it'll be out of date by tomorrow.
Yeah, it's an incredible thing. And I like what Leslie said before. The only thing that's changed about the range of the Ozark Chinquapin or changed about the Ozark Chinquapin is our understanding of it. I like that. So I'm going to turn it over to you, AJ, if you want to tell us who you are and take her away then.
Okay, my name is AJ Hendershott. I work with the Missouri Department of Conservation, and I kind of like to give everyone an idea of where I'm coming from. I am classically trained as a biologist. I have a wildlife management background and got a lot of botany classes in my background, but I also have a personal interest in history. And I like to look at old dusty books and figure out what's going on, what's the big picture here, how do we get where we are today from the past. And so this presentation is a bit of a combination about that, and so is the presentation I'm going to do later this afternoon. I do want to give credit where credit's due. This discussion about the historic range of the Ozark Chinquapin, this is not just my work. This is work that's going on in a lot of different areas. I've been working with Steve and Leslie Bost, Chris Wyatt, Terrence Jackson, Jason Watkins, and even standing on the shoulders of people who have submitted information to the USDA and different botany manuals. So this is just kind of a culmination of all of that information all pulled into one. And I'll explain more about that as we go about. Okay, so when we talk about this group of chestnuts, the family the genus Castanea, there's traditionally been only two, the American chestnut and the Allegheny Chinquapin. The Ozark Chinquapin was really never given much more credit than as subspecies of the Allegheny or just a larger version of it. And that was the way it was treated for a long time. So as we look at some of the historic range maps, you have to keep in mind that the Ozark Chinquapin was not given distinction until later into the 20th century. Here's a picture of both the Allegheny and the Ozark Chinquapin, and you can see that they have a lot of similarity. They both have a single nut in the burr. The spiny burrs are slightly different. The Allegheny has finer and shorter spines than what the Ozark Chinquapin does. And there's some other differences in the tree, but just from looking at them, especially if they're small, you're not going to see a lot of difference. But there are some key differences that I do want to make people aware of. For example, and I'll use the highlighter here, laser pointer. I want you to notice up here on this American chestnut that there are four locules or four parts to the burr when it opens up. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then if you go over here to this Ozark Chinquapin, I want you to notice there's 1, 2. And that's the same way the Allegheny does. That's a pretty important thing when you look at these nuts. First of all, you see the single nut in the Ozark. The Allegheny would be the same. And then the American chestnut typically, on average, has about 3 nuts per burr. So there are some major differences in these plants that are pretty important for us to know because we need to understand what people 100 years or 200 years ago would have known and thought back then. Pointer off. Now, I do want to talk about what common people would have known about Chinquapins and chestnuts. They know the difference. Today we have a little more confusion. I don't know that everybody is as nature savvy because we don't go out in the woods and forage for our own food. And that's something 100 years ago, people did a lot more of that. 150 years ago, it was essential to know what was edible, where it was located, and when it came into fruit. So these are the kind of things that people just intuitively knew. It was part of their life's education. And so here, let me go across some of these. The American chestnut, the Allegheny, and the Ozark Chinquapin, some differences. As I mentioned before, the American chestnut had 3 nuts per burr. The Allegheny and Ozark both had 1. The nuts ripened in a particular order. The Allegheny went first. The Ozark Chinquapin would ripen next, followed by the American chestnut. And this is the kind of thing, when you read some of the old newspaper articles, people would make reference to that in terms of things like the Chinquapins are ripening and the chestnuts won't be far behind. That's the kind of thing that you would read on a regular basis. They knew what order these things ripened in. The burrs, we talked about that. The chestnut tree could grow up to anywhere from 90 to 120 feet tall, depending on its location. So it was clearly a tree. It was an enormous tree in some cases. The circumferences would be anywhere around 8 to 10 feet, which is huge. Now, when you look at the Allegheny Chinquapin, it is a bush or a shrub, 10 to 15 feet. On occasion, you'll hear about some that were maybe 20 feet tall, but by and large, you're going to see mostly they are in the neighborhood of 10 to 15 feet tall. Circumference of these shrubs, if you look at any one of the trunks that would come up out of a thicket, maybe 4 to 9 inches. You could have something a little bigger, but that's unusual. Whereas the Ozark Chinquapin tree does get in the range of 50 to 80 feet tall. The circumferences can reach up to 4 and 5 feet, and there are instances of larger. And then finally, the blooms are different. The first bloom is going to come from the Allegheny Chinquapin. The Ozark Chinquapin is next, followed by the American chestnut in early summer. These are things that are very easy to recognize and get used to. Anybody who's ever picked dewberries and blackberries knows exactly what I'm talking about. You'll know that the dewberries are going to be 2 weeks earlier than what the blackberries are. And if you're going to collect them, you need to know where they are and when to get them. I do personally collect both of those, and I know that the last part of June, I better be ready to pick the dewberries, or else I'm going to be too late. And then about the first part of July, that's when the blackberries come into ripeness. The people back then were just as knowledgeable about a wide variety of resources. So when we see references from oral histories or from people in the newspapers, they really do know what they're talking about. And I do make that assumption when I'm reading what they're talking about, unless they give me reason not to trust them. Here's another comment that stuck out to me, and this was an interview by Jack Hatfield in 2013, and he was referring to the way things were in the 1940s and 50s, and in particular, he was speaking about the Ozark Chinquapin, and he made a comment that stuck out with me. He said, folks used to talk about Chinquapins in terms of, I got some over here, or there's a Chinquapin back over there. It was important to know about. Now, what he's referring to is being able to know where the Chinquapins were so that you could harvest them. But there's a little more implied there that he's not being overt about. You have to understand what a Chinquapin is, and you have to understand what the Chinquapin is good for. Sometimes today I'll get messages on Facebook, and what they have, they're wanting identified, really is a Chinquapin oak, or it's a Chinese chestnut or something like that. That's not necessarily something that would have confused those folks back then, because there's no difference, or I'm sorry, there's no way that you're going to be confused on whether or not you should eat a Chinquapin oak versus an Ozark Chinquapin. Chinquapin oaks would be very bitter, have a lot of tannic acid, and would have an acorn cap, as opposed to a Ozark Chinquapin, which is surrounded by a burr, has almost no tannins, and is very tasty. So those are the kind of things that people just knew. And when you hear reports about that and the accompanying detail, it's pretty clear they know what they're talking about. So walk with me as we look at some maps, and then we're going to look at some accounts, and we're going to see if we can get a kind of a puzzle piece together here with all the different relevant bits of information. Here's an 1884 map that shows 2 Castanea species. It would be the Chinquapin and the chestnut, and the 2 of them have a range that's essentially the same color. Let me see if I can pull out the highlighter here. Okay, you can see that there is a Chinquapin range over here, and then where it overlaps, it's darker. You see it overlaps the chestnut. Now I'm outlining the chestnut range, and they've got that down in through here. So we have essentially 2 species. Obviously, the Ozark is not delineated in this, but it does show up over here in parts of Missouri, Oklahoma, Texas, and Arkansas, and Louisiana. And that would be in today what we consider the modern range of the Ozark Chinquapin. Shut off the pointer. Okay, going to the next slide. Here's a range map from a book in 1908, and this one is a little pale, so let me show you a modern version of that. Here's this 1908 book that shows the range of the Allegheny Chinquapin, and keep in mind, Ozark is included as part of this, either as a subspecies or just a strange occurrence. But that's the Chinquapin range, and I want you to notice that it's a little different than that one from the 1800s. It does include parts of Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and then it has portions of Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Alabama. Fast forward in time just a little bit, you get some books from the 1940s, and you have to keep in mind that people are getting more and more interested in botany, and they're taking more interest in getting more precise and specific about what's going on. And you can see that the range map has expanded, not necessarily because the trees or the shrubs have gone into new places. Our understanding maybe has changed, or they have new information to consider. Now, if you look at the 1950s and 60s, people start to talk about the Ozark Chinquapin as a subspecies or a variety of Chinquapin, and it is separated from the Allegheny. And what I think is interesting here is not only do you have this in the Ozarks proper, but they are giving credit to a population in Alabama. Now, if you look at most of the range maps for a lot of different tree species, I'm going to say they're very conservative. And what I mean by that is if you look at an American chestnut range map from the 1950s, 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, they're going to look pretty much the same, whether they are dealing with a county by county map or they're doing kind of a generality of here's where you might expect to see them. There's not a lot of difference. Same thing with the Allegheny and the American chestnut. You're just going to see a pretty conservative map because people have a pretty good idea of where they occur. That's not the case with the Ozark Chinquapin. Oh, by the way, let me back up. I do want to point out something about the Allegheny, and I'll use the highlighter again for this. I want you to notice up here, we don't have any Alleghenies in this part of Kentucky and Tennessee, and I am going to talk about that in the future because there are some instances that need to be considered up there. I also want to point out they don't have any records up here in Missouri or in Oklahoma, and most of North Arkansas really doesn't have much in the way of Allegheny Chinquapins. So that's kind of interesting as you take a look at the range for the Ozark Chinquapin, and we'll talk about more of those in just a moment. Shut that down. Okay, next slide. Here's a 1988 book that shows the Ozark Chinquapin. It says nothing about the population in Alabama, but it does show it in Missouri, Arkansas, and Mississippi. You look in this tree guide from 2008, and they don't get real specific about what's what, but they do indicate the Ozark Chinquapin as a separate species, give you a little information about its height and some of its characteristics. But the map is pretty generalized. I looked at that and went, okay, is this the Allegheny? Is this the Ozark? What are we talking about here? And I'm assuming that the dark green is what they're referring to as the Ozark Chinquapin, but just not real definitive on that. And then here's a 2009 guide that indicates the Ozark Chinquapin lives in Missouri, Arkansas, Oklahoma, does have a few references to Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. I'm not real sure where they got their information. I would be fascinated to find out what those were from. It may actually be some new stuff that I'm not aware of, or it could be something altogether different. Okay, so when I started looking at these maps, I'm looking at a variety of references. Obviously, it's important to look at botanical records because they do have something that you can touch, feel, and look at. But it's important to look at pollen records. We were able to look at pollen records for one particular site in Missouri, for example. There's another one in Arkansas. And these pollen records will show you Castanea. That genus is pretty easy to identify. Unfortunately, you can't take it down to species. Whether you're dealing with Castanea pumila, dentata, or ozarkensis, you're not going to be able to tell which species that pollen grain came from. They all look the same. It is possible to look at archaeological literature because archaeologists are really good at piecing together what type of wood something that they find was made from. And we do have some occurrences like that. I've looked at government land office notes, which are very important when it comes to dealing with land that's been purchased. When you look at section, township, and range, Those lines were established with witness tree data. In other words, if you had a corner that was established, it might have actually been a tree, or there was a witness tree that was identified to species, measured, and with a compass bearing. So anybody who was trying to sell property could go back to that witness tree and be able to say this is the proper corner. They also would run into trees in the middle of a line. You can't walk a straight line in a forest without hitting a tree. So when they hit a tree, and I mean that metaphorically, they would stop, identify the tree, measure it, get around the tree, and continue running their line until they hit the corner. So that database is very vital for being able to look at a snapshot of what Missouri or Arkansas's woods would have looked like anywhere from 100 to 150 or 200 years ago. Botanical books are all very important because they do take a look at those botanical specimens. I did take a look at newspaper stories, and I have criteria for what I use in the newspaper stories, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Same thing with oral histories. When I talk to someone, I ask very specific questions, and those questions are pretty important because you find out that this tree was in places that you wouldn't expect or predict. And then there are tree hunters, people who volunteer for the Ozark Chinquapin Foundation as a member or as a board member. They go out sometimes on their own time and they look for Ozark Chinquapins, whether they're stump sprouting or they're mature trees. And we've learned a lot about where these trees still exist because of those tree hunters. So I want to encourage anybody who has an interest in where this tree lives, learn to identify it, learn to identify the lookalikes, and then get in contact with us, because those your eyes and ears to figure out where this tree still exists and where it could be salvaged from and maybe even preserved. Okay, so I'm going to take you on a quick tour of what I've done in Missouri. I work for the Missouri Department of Conservation. I have more access to resources here in Missouri, but I am going to talk about other states. So I just want to talk about a very specific example of how this pulled together for me, and then show you more of a state or a nationwide perspective. I used a lot of different things. For example, this one was the Government Land Office notes. If they used the word Chinquapin, spelled with the QA or the KA, that was looked upon. And then if it was KA, I would look to see if the note said anything about a Chinquapin oak. And it's interesting to see where the counties light up. So just take a look at that. I'm fairly confident that this is a reference to a Chinquapin, not a Chinquapin oak. These guys really had to know their trees, and even though they might have used words for some trees that we don't today, if you find out what those words meant to them, they were very accurate with their tree identifications. Not saying there weren't mistakes here and there, but as an aggregate, the whole crew, they were very good at identifying their trees. You take a look at Steiermark's Flora of Missouri, and those who are botanists might recognize that. It's not only a landmark publication for Missouri, but I know that that book was used for college textbooks well out of Missouri's range because it was the definitive floral textbook. It was published in 1962, and you see the map over there. We have approximately 5 counties where it was noted. There was one instance of an Allegheny, but in further reviews, that is no longer considered to be an Allegheny Chinquapin. You look at our Trees of Missouri book, which was printed in 2003. We have another 5 counties, a switch there. One was added, one was subtracted. Not really sure what the difference was, but you take a look at that in comparison to Steiermark's 2013 edition, and you can see that they have expanded the presence. They have botanical samples to be able to say, yes, this does occur in some other places here in Missouri. And then if you take a look at oral history reports, and this is individuals talking about, yeah, I remember the Chinquapin. When you talk to these people, you ask questions like, okay, the nuts, when you collected them, what were they in? And they would say burrs, or they would talk about, oh yeah, they would just fall on the ground. You didn't want to have to open them up. They would reference the burrs, and you knew that there was credibility there. One of the samples that really caught my attention was Bollinger County in Missouri, which is the far eastern county there. It looks like a big rectangle. And the individual that was telling me about this, I was interviewing him about life in the swamp. And as he was talking, he said, yeah, when we were in school, and this was the Greenbrier school he talked about, he said, we'd get under the Chinquapin tree and we'd gather up a bunch of nuts and eat them for lunch every day. And I said, whoa, wait, because he was on the foot, I mean, just the absolute toe of the Ozarks before he actually got into the swamp. So this Ozark Chinquapin, he explained it to me. There was no doubt in his mind or mine that he was talking about a Chinquapin tree. It was a good sized tree. It was obviously a nut you could eat. It was sweet. And the stories he told were just like stories I heard from Southwest Missouri and Northwest Arkansas. So these stories, the legitimate ones, I placed them on a map, and these are people that remember the trees in the county they were talking about. And this is from the 1940s and 50s before the blight would hit. Now, when it came to the newspaper articles, this is where I've got to give credit to Chris Wyatt. He did a deep dive into newspapers all across the nation with a word search for Chinquapin, or Chinquapin spelt with a K. Incidentally, Chinquapin with a QU is predominantly the way the word is spelt through antiquity, and it's within modern times and even rarity in history that Chinquapin was spelt with a K. That may be something I write an article for the website later. But the criteria, we looked at papers from 1833 to 1960, and because of the knowledge people would have to have back then, I did assume that people knew about a Chinquapin and how it was different from a chestnut. They didn't talk about it in the newspaper articles, but when you read some of these references, I think you're going to come along with me and you're going to say, yeah, I think they knew what they were talking about too. Any Chinquapin that was noted taller than 30 feet or a diameter greater than 1 foot was added to a list that I kept for historical references, because this is clearly outside of the growth range of Allegheny Chinquapin. Also, the sizes were inferred through use, and I'll be more specific about that. But if you're going to, for example, use a Chinquapin tree to make railroad ties, it has to be a tree. You're not going to make that out of a shrub. So these are all important clues as we look at the newspaper articles. Now, if I could identify where the newspaper was and they were talking about something local, I would keep it local. But if they were passing along a story from somewhere else, I would be pretty mindful of that. And I'll give you one example. There was a newspaper up in Carroll, Missouri, asking for staves for barrels. Now, they weren't asking for wood from their local area. They were trying to get wood from the Ozarks, and they listed post oak, white oak, and Chinquapin wood. And the towns they mentioned were in Shannon and Dent County, the ones that I was able to still identify as a town. So that told me that even though this was from Carroll County, that's not where the Chinquapin was occurring. They were trying to get Chinquapin wood from the counties that had it, which would have been Shannon and Dent County. We also had trees that were found by Ozark Chinquapin Foundation members to be able to say, yes, they do occur in this county. And we have evidence of that and could go out and get a botanical sample if we needed them. We have pollen records such as Cupola Pond in Carter County. And what this boils down to is a lasagna at the bottom of a sinkhole that's been plugged up. So you have all these years of pollen all through the growing season. So you might get the spring pollen, the summer pollen, the fall pollen. And then after that, there's another layer of spring, summer, fall, spring, summer, fall, spring, summer, fall. And if you dig down through that, you can identify Castanea pollen in various locations throughout that pollen lasagna at the bottom of the sinkhole pond. And Castanea was identified positively in some of these samples. We have 2 archaeological sites in Missouri. One of them was a wood fragment identified from an Osage cultural site in Vernon County. And there was a spear thrower at a bluff dweller site, which is from the Archaic period, roughly 4,000 to maybe 10,000 years ago. And that was in Berry County. There's also some evidence that these bluff dwellers had similar items in northwestern Arkansas. If you Google bluff dweller sites or bluff dweller atlatls, you'll find out some more information about that. And then we have some botanical text that would give you clues sometimes. If it wasn't a map, they might say, here's where the plant has been reported in the past. And you notice here, Wayne County, Stone County, Newton. These all give us some idea of where the plant could be had. All right, so when you look at all of these things pulled together, and there'd be a lot of overlap because some of these, it's very obvious the tree has been in this location. This would have been a historic map for what the range might have looked like in Missouri. I think the eastern part of Missouri is a little underrepresented because I think the blight might have gotten there a little earlier, and some of the deforestation combined with that, you may not have had a real clear picture of where the Chinquapins were living at that time. But regardless, I feel like that's a pretty responsible map to say this is where this tree has in the past lived, and in some cases still lives yet today. And hopefully that makes sense. If not, put something in the chat box and Tori will interrupt and she will make sure that I get that, because I want to make sure everybody's with me so far. Because I'm about to leap into a national scene, in looking at all the different evidence that is there to be able to say, here's where this thing lives. Several years back at an Ozark Chinquapin Foundation meeting, Joey Shaw from the University of Tennessee, Chattanooga, gave a presentation where he collected leaves from chinquapins and chestnuts all across the United States. Now, he didn't do an exhaustive search, but it was representative. In other words, he wouldn't have gone out and gotten hundreds from every state. He would get what he could from various states, and then he would group them based on the leaf's form. If the leaf looked like and typed out as an Allegheny chinquapin, that's what he would call it. If it looked like it was a Ozark chinquapin, he would call it that. If it was typed out as a American chestnut, that's what he would call it. Then he did chloroplast DNA, and what he found was that the Ozark chinquapin is very different from the American chestnut and even the Allegheny chinquapin, even though they have some superficial similarities in the number of nuts per burr and other things like that. Genetically, as far as the chloroplasts are concerned, they are very, very different. Now, what's interesting to me is that he had 3 plants that typed out, as far as the form is concerned, as an Allegheny, but when he did the genetics, he found out they looked very much like the rest of the Ozark chinquapins. Now, he had one in Arkansas, which you can see the star over there, but these 2 were in places that no one would have ever suspected an Ozark chinquapin lived, one in the panhandle of Florida and the other one in Virginia. Now, according to the genetics, these definitely typed out closer to the Ozark chinquapin. So that's pretty important as a clue, and in and of itself means something, but I want you to take a look at the whole evidence swath before we get done. So hold out your judgment until we get done here. I want to jump into a map now. I want to talk about Texas, and Terrence Jackson really helped quite a bit on this. From botanical surveys and other textbooks, Texas had some records of the Ozark chinquapin being in kind of that northeastern quadrant. Now, Terrence Jackson, he does a lot of work with landowners and co-ops, and he likes to help people that want to raise wild turkeys and do wildlife management. So as a consequence, he's a very, very credible botanist. And he's the type of person that's on people's land. He's taking assessment of what's there and what is growing and what could live there. And he's been pretty observant to say, you know, I think we have this or that. One of the things he noticed in particular is Ozark chinquapins. And talking to Terrence, he was able to confirm, here are counties that I have been in that I know these trees do live, and this is where they occur. So when I combine his occurrence record with what has been known in the past, you get this new record that shows that Texas has a more robust occurrence of these things than what it had been credited for in the past. Now, if you remember some of those past maps, they did give credit to the chinquapin in general occurring in Texas and Oklahoma. And what we're seeing here on this map validates that yes, this chinquapins did grow there, and in particular, many of them are Ozark chinquapins. Now let's slide over to Alabama. This is a place that chinquapins were given credit for in the 1940s and 50s. And I want to read to you this particular quote. It says, "Big chinquapins," that's the headline. And this is from the Andalusia Star. And it says, "Left some choice chinquapins at the Star's office this morning. The tree upon which these nuts were grown is 7 feet in circumference, 3 feet from the ground, 150 of the chinquapins weighing a pound. This tree has been bearing for 17 years. Mr. Bradley is a believer in nut trees. He has 2 chestnut trees as large as the chinquapin tree. We ought to plant more nut trees." Now, what I find interesting about that, first of all, is, whoa, 7 feet. And that's way out of the Ozarks. Furthermore, do you notice that they talk about the difference between he's got a chinquapin and he has 2 chestnut trees the same size? Again, I'm making the assumption that they understand what they're talking about. They understand the difference in when the nuts mature and then how they come out of there. They know the difference between these trees. And if you were to just look at that one newspaper article, you might say, well, maybe they were confused, or maybe this is something that they didn't really know what they were talking about. But when you start looking at a lot of these different newspaper articles, you see very similar comments about this tree, this chinquapin tree. They wouldn't call it an Ozark chinquapin, but they would call it a chinquapin tree. There are instances where I read we had Chinquapin bushes and trees. They said both. And I find that very interesting. Sometimes they would give you sizes, sometimes they would not. So if you take a look at this next map, anywhere I would find a credible reference to a tree, I would put that in red. That's a historic account. Now the green comes from botanical information, as well as information from Jason Watkins and the Alabama Plant Atlas. And these are counties that they definitely have something growing there that is not an Allegheny. Now you may find there's some discussion about whether or not there is a different species within the Chinquapins, that maybe there's something unique about these that are different from not only the Allegheny, but maybe even the Ozark Chinquapin, but that's something for botanists to work out. Time being, some of these trees are clearly trees. They grow large, and they're different from the bushes. Okay, next I want to hear from, have we got Jack Herring on the line? I want to talk to him. Jack is somebody.
I'm here.
Oh, great, Jack. I'm going to give you a brief introduction. I'm going to have you tell folks about your memories on the Chinquapin. The reason I've got Jack on the line, Jack has had a career working with the outdoors, with wild resources, with managing plants and wildlife. And Jack has a good botanical understanding. He has been the type of person that says, there's something different going on. And he's been saying that all through his career. And, Jack retired, I think, in, 2001? I think I've got 200 on there. It's 2001. But you've got 32 years of experience, and that's worth something. And I want to hear from you on what you know about the differences in the Chinquapins in Mississippi, and where you've seen them as far as that goes, and just your thoughts on that. So, Jack, by all means, thanks for being here today, and tell us what you know.
Thank you very much for having me, and I appreciate the opportunity. What I would tell you, my comments are basically restricted to Mississippi because that's where I grew up and spent most of my working life. To give you some idea, I was born in north central Mississippi in 1944, and my dad was born in 1913, and he grew up on a farm, and we had timberland as well as cropland. And as a very small boy, the first I remember about Chinquapins, and I restate what was said a while ago, we did not know them as Ozark Chinquapins. To us, we knew that local area, and the Chinquapin was Chinquapin, which in our case was trees and still are trees. The first I ever saw or heard of them was in the late 1940s when I was 5, 6 years old, and my dad would come in from what we called the rabbit farm, which was some fairly high hills that had scarlet oak and Chinquapins, and as well as other trees there. Daddy would bring the nuts in the fall when you'd be cutting firewood for the fireplace. And he would come in with Chinquapins as well as a few American chestnuts, which were never viable. They would all be aborted, so they were pretty much gone by that time. But my dad also talked about in the 1920s, and this is somewhat hard to believe, but he and his brothers told me about how they would go with a mule wagon and pick up a mule wagon full of American chestnuts and carry them to Winona, Mississippi, and sell them. And a mule wagon full of American chestnuts was going to run about 12, 13 bushels of American chestnuts. But needless to say, yes, I got a little bit older. We would be in the woods, and there was at least 3 different places on our land that was separated by about 2 miles that had Chinquapins growing on 3 different places. There wouldn't be many, and these would be trees that'd be anywhere from 4 to 8 inches DBH and be 25, 35, 40 feet tall. And fast forward till 1969, when I graduated from college with a degree in wildlife and had quite a bit of botanical training at that time, I went to work on the side of Barnett Reservoir in Madison County, Mississippi, which is central Mississippi now. I've just moved 80 miles further south. And we had a big research lab there, which I was head of. And guess what? Out in our front yard and on a kind of a mild bluff hillside there was about 8 or 10 Chinquapin trees. And these, again, were about 6, 7 inches diameter and about 25, 30 feet tall, and they produced every year. And then as time went on, I started trying to tell botanists that, and I'm talking about college trained botanists. I was college trained in botany, but I was primarily, my first order was a fisheries guy. But I had a boss that loved native plants, and he was always telling me to dig them up, bring them back, set them out at the lab, which I did just about anything you could ever imagine that we found that was a little bit unusual, creating our own kind of self-styled arboretum there. But I kept seeing Chinquapin trees, and I would tell people. And then about that time, I started doing some work in South Mississippi and discovered the little small Chinquapin bush down there. And I said, well, hey, this is something totally different. But no one would believe me. The botanists around, with the exception of one or two, would say, no, it's the same thing. Well, I mean, it was obvious that they were totally different plants. And over the years, then in 1984, I bought and built a house in Rankin County, which was just across the Pearl River from Madison County, and about 1,000 feet behind my house on a place called Goshen Hill, which was the second highest hill in Rankin County. There was a stand of Chinquapin trees, and I believe Steve Boss is somewhere there. He's got a picture of one. He and I standing under it. It was 10 inches DBH and 42 feet tall. Hurricane Katrina snapped the top out of it, and it kind of died back. But that entire hill there, which covered, 500-600 acres, because it was a huge hill, had scattered around on it Chinquapin trees. And one of my best friends that I worked for in the Department of Wildlife for years and years had grown up on that hill, and he would tell me about how in the late 1930s and early 1940s he would walk to the little country store and pick up both Chinquapin and American chestnut and eat them. And behind my house there, close to this tree that Steve took pictures of several years, maybe 10 years ago, there were logs laying there that were either American chestnut or Chinquapin. I cut into them, and I know a little bit about woods and how to identify them. And it was the genus Castagna, so the wood was, and they'd never rotted, and they're laying there today. Of course, they are slowly deteriorating. But the point I want to make to you is that, sometimes people that you don't expect to know a lot about things know more than you might think. As AJ has just mentioned to you there. But I know of it's this week when y'all called and asked me to talk to you, I immediately made one phone call, and I had 6 locations of Chinquapins, and some of them sent me pictures that I looked at and said, "Yep, that's Ozark Chinquapin that are alive and well in the counties of north central Mississippi, Montgomery, Attala, Webster, Rankin, Madison, as well as other counties. They're there." The biggest problem we had, and thankfully DNA has been able to clear some of that up, was that nobody would believe us. But that's not uncommon. I ran into this on some of the wild azaleas years ago, ran into it in some of the viburnums, until you just literally hit some of these professional botanists over the head with something. They didn't want to believe you had found something that they hadn't found. But there's not many. And some of them seem to be dying back. The one I mentioned there that was so big behind my house in Rankin County, when Hurricane Katrina snapped the top out of it, of course it died back. It had been broken completely off halfway up. But there are other trees in that area still growing today. And so that's kind of a quick statement of what I know about the Ozark Chinquapins. And like you said, until just a few years ago, or actually, I guess when I was in college, I started reading Small's manual, and then Manual for the Carolinas, and then a boy from Arkansas back in the early 1970s gave me a book on Arkansas, and they mentioned those Ozark Chinquapins. And then I realized what I was looking at. But until that time, they were Chinquapins to me. But and I certainly am very familiar with a Chinquapin shrub that's in South Mississippi. But what we're talking about is something totally different.
Jack, real quick, could you tell us what type of landscape these trees are growing on?
Okay. Most of the time, if you think about the landscape, they would generally, not always, but generally be on well-drained hillsides, often on the north or the east slope, but again, not necessarily so. Sometimes in the better locations, the ones on our place had growing right by them, basswood, ginseng. Now you don't see ginseng as much as you do the Chinquapins, but that was a component of the forest right there. One location was about 10 or 15 feet up vertically above a small creek, and it was actually on the edge of one of our fields. It actually hung out into one of the fields that we plowed as a boy on the edge of the woods there. And of course, in early June, when it'd be blooming, you can smell the blooms. They're kind of odoriferous bloom. But well-drained sites that are generally, I don't think I've ever seen one in a pure pine forest. It might be mixed pine, but hardwoods. And the ones I have, and I've seen them out in openings. There was one in Rankin County at the edge of the opening for one of the Mississippi Forestry Commission fire tower was there that hung over a sandy little road there, and seemed to me to prefer sandy habitats. But you would find them in areas that you would sometimes see sourwood. It would not be a wet habitat, and it wouldn't be a super dry habitat either one.
Jack, thank you very much for your time on that. We're going to move on so we can stay on time, but your insight has been very valuable, and you've contributed to expanding my knowledge about the tree and where it lives. So thank you very much for taking time to visit with us today.
You're just quite welcome, and y'all have a great meeting.
Thank you very much, Jack. Okay, based on some of that information with botanical surveys and so forth, I want you to notice, now this, the green is not exclusively just from Jack, but he probably doubled my understanding of where this Chinquapin tree occurred. And one of them, if you'll notice that Square County in the lower right-hand middle part of Mississippi, that is a historic reference to the former Chinquapin state champion. And then when he went to go check it out, it was nothing but a stump. So the tree was there, but he was not able to check it out in its full glory. So, and then also you'll notice a historic occurrence, the red one up at the top. That one also has modern occurrence. I just didn't change it so that it was green. I wanted to be able to show that there was a historic occurrence there as well. But you can see pretty healthy representation of Ozark Chinquapin or Chinquapin trees in Mississippi. I want to take a look at Virginia. Here's an interesting quote from a newspaper. An enormous Chinquapin tree. Doubtless few people know that this little shrub known as the Chinquapin ever grows larger than the ordinary bush that we see along the roadside. Anyone holding such opinion may have to effectually remove by visiting from the farm of Mr. Sparcher. 4 miles from town, in his orchard, there is growing today one of these trees that is 4 feet in diameter. Pretty amazing size, again, similar to what we read in other historic occurrences. And you can see that in Roanoke County. And then that genetic work that Joey Shaw did, where he found a Pamela that he genetically typed out to be Ozarkensis, is right there, not too far away, 4 counties away. Those are the only 2 occurrences I'm aware of there in Virginia, but that's pretty amazing stuff. Here's another one I want to share with you from Maryland. Judge Peter found a Chinquapin tree measuring about 25 feet in height and 1.5 feet across the trunk. The ground was covered with burrs and nuts, which showed that the Chinquapins had ripened much later than usual, and much later than is usual for such nuts hereabouts, and probably about the time of the chestnuts ripened. Remember, we talked about the Allegheny goes to fruit first, then the Ozark, then the American chestnut. And right here, they're giving us some evidence that not only is this a huge tree, but the nuts are not ripening at the right time, and they know this. So that was a fantastic clue that was pretty amazing. Found another one about a large tree, and here's the 2 counties in Maryland that would have had that. Moving along to North Carolina. We had an individual emailed Steve Bost in 2009. He said he visited his daughter in North Carolina, and this is a modern occurrence of a 25 to 30 foot tall Chinquapin tree that's about 26 inches in circumference. That's pretty significant. Here's a historic reference. Madison Chinquapin is largest in state. Followed by this report, Marshall, September 24th, the Chinquapin tree, according to experts, the largest in North Carolina, is again yielding nuts in the Tillery Branch section of Madison County. This tree is nearly 60 feet high and is 4 feet in diameter, a foot above the ground. The average size for these trees is about 2 and 5 inches in diameter and approximately 5 to 20 feet high, although most of them are about 10 to 15 feet high. That's around Asheville, North Carolina. An enormous tree. Here's another good one. This one was submitted to Ripley's Believe It or Not. I don't know if it ever was included in a publication, but I know it was submitted. And it does say in the newspaper, believe it or not, this is a Chinquapin tree. And you notice in the picture there, a gentleman is standing behind a very large tree, 11 feet and 11 inches in circumference and 45.5 inches in diameter. And it grows on a farm, and it talks about how the freak feature of this tree is that Chinquapins usually grow on small bushes, and few of this species have ever been known to attain the size of even a small tree. The other Chinquapins on the Bishop Farm and all over Madison County, for that matter, are small bushes. They clearly understand that this is different than normal. 1931 in Asheville. You take a look at, I'm not going to go through all the historic accounts, but you'll notice there's a nice smattering all across the state of North Carolina for historic references, and we do have some modern occurrences where people have given us samples of leaves and photographs to be able to say, yes, that is an Ozark Chinquapin, and they do occur in these two counties that are coded in green. Georgia has its own Chinquapins. Here's a newspaper article from 1881, the biggest of the Chinquapin trees. The biggest Chinquapin tree we ever saw, we think, is on the Carson Old Plantation near Briar Creek Church. It measured 180 feet in circumference. Now, before you go crazy on that, hold up, because they actually mean something different by circumference here, and they explain it. Between 200 and 300 people can be shaded by it all day long. It is thought it can furnish over 300 persons a quart of Chinquapins each to eat for one day. The 180 feet around is not the body, but the limbs gracefully hanging to the ground laden with fruit. It forms a most comfortable tent and is one of the old pioneer trees of Georgia. Again, I trust them to understand what a Chinquapin is, and a tree that has limbs of 180 feet circumference, that is a very grand and majestic tree. Again, from 1881. Here's a good one. Mr. Knuckles of Whitfield County has growing in his yard a Chinquapin tree that measures 15 feet in circumference at the ground. 3 feet above the ground, it measures 9 feet. The tree bears bushels of fruit every year. 1883. So if you take a look at both modern occurrence, and which is one, we have a Georgia Ozark Chinquapin tree that's been validated, as well as some of these historic articles. And just because a county has a red color doesn't mean that it was just one instance. There may have been multiple instances for a particular county. Sometimes size infers what you're dealing with here. And let me give you an example. This one came from the Nashville Patriot in 1856. And it states to timbermen, cross ties wanted. So they're wanting railroad ties. Proposals be received at the office of Edgefield and Kentucky Railroad Company until November 10th for the delivery of 25,000 cross ties. Said ties to be 8 feet long with ends cut square, 6 inches thick, and sawed or hewed true on the parallel faces, each of which shall be at least 6 inches wide, exclusive of sap, when sawed or hewed on more than two sides to be at least 7 inches wide. They must be of good quality of red cedar, white Chinquapin, or post oak. Proposals must be made for delivering the whole lumber to Nashville's or Payne's Lumber. I want to stop there for a second. I don't know what a white Chinquapin difference is from any other type of Chinquapin, but I want you to pay attention to the size of that. Those are pretty enormous sizes for something that otherwise would be considered a bush. I also want to point out they're indicating a location here, the Cumberland River. That's going to become important here in just a moment, but keep that in mind. So they give some more points of where you could drop these off. But again, that's 1856 in Nashville. Now let's take a look at ties. When you're talking about a railroad tie, they described them 8 feet long, 6 by 7 inches on the ends. And to get a log that size, you have to have a tree that's pretty good size on the small end, because that's the limiting factor. If it's the right size at the base but not the top, you're not going to make a railroad tie. They're going to reject it. So the trees had to be at least 9 or more inches on the small end of the log, which is over 8 feet above the ground. So you're dealing with something that is clearly not a shrub. This is a tree. And that's, I want you to notice this location, where that came from, where that solicitation is. This is a local newspaper soliciting for logs or ties from the immediate area. Now, my next occurrence, for those who are familiar with Ryman Auditorium in Nashville, Captain Tom Ryman was he was a famous riverboat man. And that's who the Ryman Auditorium is named after, and there's reasoning behind that I won't go into now for sake of time. In 1895, I found 4 or 5 articles that dealt with Mr. Ryman wanting a boat built out of Chinquapin logs. Now let's read 2 of these instances, because there's unique information in these 2 that helps us piece this together. I'm gonna get a drink real quick here. Okay, Captain Tom Ryman is going to build another new boat. He is getting out the Chinquapin logs on the Cumberland River to be sawed up into timbers for the hull. His new steamer, Reuben Dunbar, just built by Howard, will be ready to start out shortly. The Times-Picayune, New Orleans, Louisiana, 1895. In June of 1895, which is a little earlier, a similar story ran. It said a big sawmill at Paducah is sawing Chinquapin logs into 30,000 feet of board lumber to be used to construction of Captain Tom Ryman's boat being built by Ed Howard. Similar articles ran up in Paducah, and I think another one ran in Mississippi. The point here is that is some enormous amounts of wood, and if you're cutting this from Chinquapin, it better be a tree, because no one's going to want to make a boat out of a shrub. Let's just examine those numbers for a moment. Pardon me. To cut 30,000 board feet, you're going to have to cut up 115 Chinquapin trees, and they have to be a very specific size. Each tree would have to average 20 inches diameter at 18 feet. And this would be equal to having 260 board feet per tree. In other words, you're going to get essentially 2.5 logs out of each Ozark Chinquapin tree. That's a lot of lumber. Now, this becomes a little more interesting to me. Not only are you not going to make a boat out of shrub lumber, but take a look at this. That article that was asking for white Chinquapin logs for the railroad ties, that's right there on the Cumberland River. If you go downstream and meet it where Paducah is, which is where that mill was supposed to be cutting up all this Chinquapin lumber, they were sourcing that from the Cumberland River, it said. So they probably cut the timber, hauled it down to the mill in Paducah, built the steamboat, which then would have run the Ohio and the Mississippi River, which is why Louisiana, Mississippi, and Kentucky were all reporting on this. Now, if you remember back to those maps about the Allegheny, there's not even an Allegheny Chinquapin supposed to be in this part of Tennessee or Kentucky. There were supposed to be some chestnuts, but again, I'm assuming people understand the difference between a Chinquapin and a chestnut. So fascinating information. I'm not sure what to do with this one, but it certainly piques the interest and makes you want to dig a little deeper and see what else you can find. All right, so drawing this all to a close, because I know I'm about 5 minutes over here. If you look at this map that I have right now, I have green that says these are modern occurrences, and I'm making an arbitrary a line in the sand. If this is something from, let's say, the mid-1970s or later, then I'm putting it in green. If it's something that has been historic and nobody's found a plant there in the last, I don't know, 45, 50 years, then maybe that's historic. So you look at this map and you can see a very robust occurrence in the Ozarks, which is deserving because this tree is known as the Ozark Chinquapin. But if you're looking at the size of these trees and the historic occurrences, you see what looks like a shotgun pattern. The tree is scattered all over the eastern United States. And there are certainly some modern occurrences. And I think what we're seeing is that this is pretty interesting in terms of the Ozark Chinquapin is widely distributed across the eastern United States, but it's not commonly distributed. And let me give you a kind of a summary of this. If I were drawing a map of the historic range, this is what I would make it into. And the Ozark section probably makes a lot of sense, as does Mississippi and Alabama. The area over North Carolina and Virginia, there was just so much random occurrence all across the place that I don't think that means that they were common or super abundant or even in adjoining populations, but they were just scattered out there commonly enough that you would expect to be able to run across one from time to time. The other isolated occurrences I would leave into a drop. And then I am highlighting that Cumberland River area as a potential area for the Ozark Chinquapin. Now today, I would be more apt to say, here's what a modern range of the Ozark Chinquapin would look like, including Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Mississippi, Alabama, and then all of the states that have the Ozarks in them. So with that, let me conclude by stating the range of the Ozark Chinquapin is a real challenge to put together. And let me say this, the work is not done. There needs to be a whole lot more work done. I think now we realize we need to look even in places where it would be assumed there's only two species, which would be dentata and pumila, but there may be a third. The chloroplast DNA points toward a larger but disjointed range that's larger than previously thought. Historical accounts support a larger disjointed range. And it's just clear that there needs to be more work done on this. So somebody who's an aspiring botanist, this may be a fantastic project to do a little digging and find out what do we have out there in the eastern United States. So wrapping it up, today we see the range map of the Chinquapin changing only because we just know more about it. The tree is not suddenly doing great because the range has expanded. It's still suffering from the blight. It still needs conservation work. But we've got a long way to go before this tree is ever restored to something even close to resembling its former glory. But the map is changing because we better understand the tree and its place in the landscape. So if nothing else, it shows that there's a lot of people that have something at stake here. And although the species is named the Ozark Chinquapin, it is by no means limited to just the Ozark. It belongs in the deep south, and it's part of the mountains out there. So it's something that I would like to encourage folks to be on the lookout for. You never know what you've got until you look at it and ask yourself, how do I know what this is? There are resources out there to help you with that. Our website has quite a bit of information about the differences between the Ozark Chinquapin, Alleghenies, and lookalikes. So get on there, take a look at it, and get out there in the woods and see what you can find. The article, I'm going to have an article submitted to Leslie, hopefully for posting sometime soon, entitled Size Matters. And it's going to detail a lot of those reports that I highlighted in red. And it's going to detail a lot of those historical occurrences. And with that, are there any questions in the chat box?
I don't have any questions posted in the chat.
Okay, well, if any come up, certainly email those to me or we can talk about them at a break.
AJ, we're doing good on the time right now since we don't have any questions, but I do have a couple of things if I can comment on here. If you can bring back up that map of Virginia, I don't know if you caught this, but that 1908 book that had the gigantic Chinquapin in it in Virginia, you know, the actual picture of the Chinquapin, if you'll look at the location of it, it says Suffolk, Virginia, which is in eastern Virginia, all the way over to the right, all the way over down by, let's see, I think near Virginia Beach, near the coast. And so the reason I'm saying that is that's the location they gave of that large, what they thought rarely occurring tree, you know, 1 to 3 feet in diameter. It's in that book in 1908. And so I just knew it said Virginia, and I went back just now and looked at the picture I took of that, and it actually has it there. Now that's kind of significant because the guy that does Virginia champion tree lists today, I don't know if you're looking at that, he, you know, they just thought they had really large Alleghenies. In fact, the champion Chinquapin of Virginia is from right there. And I told that guy, I said, that's not Allegheny. I said, if you have something 40 or 50 feet tall, you know, and, you know, 8 or 10 inches diameter, DBH, that's not an Allegheny. And so we had a really interesting conversation. But that book that you got the pictures of shows all the way over here in Suffolk County, Virginia, which is near Virginia Beach, Virginia. And that guy told me there's a mountain there that has a sandy, well-drained band around it. And that's where he found his at today. And that's where they showed the gigantic Chinquapins at. They had a picture of it in that book from 1908.
I'll be doggone. I thought this was going to be out of date by tomorrow. It's out of date today. Sorry.
Yeah. And then one more thing, and I couldn't unmute myself quick enough. I was going to tell Jack that tree that I went to over there, we went to a lot of work to make this happen. Jack now lives in North Carolina, for those that don't know. So the state champion tree that he found, we actually have, we got a living genetic bank. We actually got grafts of that tree, and we have those in our research test plots. And I've even got some here at my property too. So we actually saved that genetics. In fact, I cross-pollinated that one this year. And so just from all the work Jack did, even though he's in North Carolina, to give you an idea how difficult this was to do, he had the guy on the phone that has the farm near there and walked him to where he had that tree marked. And he sent samples in to us. And we also sent those in for a molecular study that Jean up at Notre Dame's, we keep waiting for it. So Sandra, if you're on here, ask her, tell her we're waiting for the results of that study, that genome study, and that's a good way to know. But really good job. Talk about being a resourceful detective. And so yeah, we added another dot just now. And so I think that's significant because it's a historic record in that book. And that's at the time the forests were being cleared off when they actually started doing the research for that book. And then we've got a modern occurrence there today, the same location.
Well, thanks to everybody who helped contribute to this, and appreciate the time to be able to visit with you. I thank you very much for that. Thanks for everybody's time.